Hello, comrades. I'm Matt Mitrovich, the alternate historian. Patreon sponsored What If today that wants us to answer the question, what if the Soviet Union won the Cold War? Before I begin, let me just say I don't find this scenario particularly plausible. The fundamental problem is that barring alien space bats, there was no chance for the Soviets to win the Cold War. It might have seemed at the time that the United States was locked in an ideological duel to the death with an equally powerful superpower, but in reality things were much more one-sided. The USSR was poorly managed during its existence, with its leaders ranging from brutal dictators with little regard for human life to incompetent bureaucrats more interested in living the high life than actually taking care of their people. Couple that with the millions of lives lost and the economic destruction caused by the German invasion in World War II, and it's not surprising in hindsight that the Soviets fell when they did in our timeline. That said, I was asked to make a video about the Soviets winning the Cold War, so that's what I'm going to do. But if it seems the Russians are making all of the right decisions and Americans are making all the wrong ones, well, that is because they are. Yes, this timeline will be implausible, but I'm going to at least try and craft a scenario that sounds possible and is at least fun for me. Are you still on board? Good, let's begin. In our timeline, American President Franklin Delano Roosevelt dumped his then Vice President Henry A. Wallace from the ticket when he ran for an unprecedented fourth term. This was because Wallace was very liberal and unpopular with Democrat leaders. Instead, Roosevelt went with Senator Harry Truman, who made a name for himself fighting waste and inefficiency in the federal government wartime contracts. When FDR died, Truman became president and, in my humble opinion, laid the groundwork for what would become America's eventual victory in the Cold War by renouncing isolation and instead pushing an interventionist foreign policy that contained the spread of communism early on. Now let's assume Wallace was at the steering wheel during this pivotal time in American history. What would he have done differently? Assuming that FDR and Wallace still win the 1944 election and FDR dies on schedule, Wallace would become president in 1945. One of the first big decisions would be whether or not to use nuclear weapons in Japan. Considering Wallace was critical of nukes in our timeline, I would argue he would decide not to use them and instead order a ground invasion. Thus, Operation Downfall, the proposed Allied invasion of Japan, is carried out, and it's a bloody mess. Japan would be able to predict Allied invasion plans accurately, and thus adjust their defense accordingly. Although their military was severely diminished due to the earlier losses in Allied bombing, Japan makes up for this with mass human wave attacks by civilians, some only armed with swords and bamboo spears, before attacking them with regular armory units. Allied casualties just run into the millions as the war drags on before Japan finally surrenders in 1947. The bloody end of the war also turns Americans away from any further interventions overseas as isolation comes back in style, decades earlier than in our timeline. Meanwhile, Soviet forces had more success after they declared war on Japan. They helped the Chinese drive the Japanese off the mainland and invade the Japanese island of Hokkaido. They also managed to occupy all of Korea, thus there is no North or South Korea, just one united communist Korea. Post-war Japan, however, is not so lucky, and finds itself split between various occupation zones, eventually organized into a communist North Japan and a capitalist South Japan. Thus, while the Korean War might be avoided, Japan could face their own similar conflict down the road. Meanwhile, outside of East Asia, President Wallace seeks peace with the Soviet Union so he can focus on domestic issues back home, like healthcare and civil rights. In our timeline, Wallace was a strong supporter of New Deal liberalism and thought a militaristic stance toward the Soviets would be counterproductive. Thus, he would likely not challenge Soviet actions, like Stalin's refusal to remove Soviet troops from Persia, aka present-day Iran, in 1946, an action that could lead to the Persian government being overthrown by communists. Wallace would also proudly reject any kind of aid package to Europe. In our timeline, President Truman approved billions to rebuild Western Europe following World War II in an initiative known as the Marshall Plan. It was hoped that the economic recovery caused by the plan would reduce the influence of communism in Europe. In this alternate timeline, however, Wallace would oppose any such plan out of fear it would only antagonize the Soviets. Plus, it's likely the final cost of defeating Japan would make any aid to Europe politically and financially unlikely. Thus, without the Marshall Plan, communism spreads quickly through Europe. Greece is the first to fall, as the communist insurgency it was dealing with in 1947 in our timeline was one of the main drivers for the Marshall Plan in the first place. Later, Italy and France soon elect their own communist governments. West Germany even unites decades earlier with East Germany as part of the deal to receive economic assistance through the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance, or CMEA, which in our timeline was the Soviet answer to the Marshall Plan, and would be a much more powerful organization in this alternate timeline. I would also assume that Wallace wouldn't object to handing over West Berlin to this new united Germany, thus no Berlin blockade. Plus, not only would the North Atlantic Treaty Organization not exist in this timeline, with an American president not interested in opposing the spread of communism, but any close relationship between the United States and the United Kingdom would be derailed. Wallace is on record as saying, "Aside from our common language and common literary tradition, we have no more in common with imperialistic England than with communist Russia." Thus, Britain would be on its own, and to protect itself from the Soviets would need to forge a close relationship with the rest of the British Commonwealth and those few capitalist nations left in Europe. Nevertheless, they would be just as conciliatory to the Soviets as Wallace would be, which the Soviets would be happy with as long as they provide a market for trade. Presumably, if Wallace does everything I described earlier, he would handily lose the 1948 presidential election to his Republican opponent. I would argue Republican Robert A. Taft, son of former President William Taft and a staunch isolationist, would be the likely nominee due to America's swing toward isolation as alternate timeline. He may even gain support of the South, who would abandon the Democrats due to Wallace's campaign for civil rights. Under Taft, America fully returns to isolation and dismantles the New Deal. Meanwhile, there was such a negative reaction to Wallace's civil rights campaign that the Supreme Court will uphold segregation a few years later. As for the Soviets, Taft is willing to tolerate them as long as they don't interfere in the Americas. Thus, with America isolating itself from much of the world, the Soviet Union begins a period of reform and internal reorganization. This picks up in 1953 when Stalin dies and is replaced by Lavrentiy Beria, Stalin's secret police chief and all-around despicable person, who in our timeline led the Soviet Union for a brief period before being ousted in a coup d'etat by Soviet hardliners. They apparently feared his liberal reforms and thought he would make a deal with the United States in exchange for money to rebuild the war-torn Soviet economy. In this alternate timeline, however, with the U.S. uninterested in opposing the Soviets, Beria would likely survive in the top spot and continue his reforms with little interference from other Soviet leaders, probably because they would be purged shortly after Beria consolidated power. De-Stalinification would begin with the gulags being closed and Stalin's cult of personality being denounced. The Soviet government would focus on increasing food production, improving healthcare, and building up the Soviet infrastructure instead of spending it on the military. Considering that Beria was responsible in overseeing the Soviet atomic bomb project, he knows how to manage big projects, and thus could probably handle the logistics necessary to rebuild the Soviet economy. On the international stage, the Soviet Union would be free for the time being to become the undisputed world leader. Without the pressure of the Cold War, the Soviets could afford to be pragmatic about what kind of governments they would work with. Although they would prefer fellow communist revolutionaries, they would trade with any nation who paid lip service to the ideas of Marx and Lenin. Thus, membership in the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance expands in Africa and Asia, encouraged by the Soviet Union's policy of allowing more non-Russians to rise to leadership positions in communist organizations. Still, all good things must come to an end. At some point, the United States wakes up to the fact that the world is falling to communism. Perhaps one too many governments in Latin America go left and nationalize American businesses, causing America to freak out. In 1964, America elects an anti-communist interventionist president who initiates a massive military buildup before ordering the first direct interventions in the Caribbean and Central America in support of so-called democratic freedom fighters, while ordering the Strategic Services Unit, the CIA never being created in this timeline, to undermine red governments across the world. Some overtures are also made to the British bloc, but while the Brits are initially sympathetic to America's goals of ending communism, they have no interest in risking a confrontation with the Soviets. As America begins to lash out, the Soviets organize to contain them while trying to avoid a nuclear confrontation. Weapons are secretly shipped to partisans resisting American occupation in Latin America, while the Soviets publicly protest American war crimes. Meanwhile, the Soviets sponsor the military wing of the CMEA, a military alliance of communist nations called the Paris Pact, which includes China, who the Soviets consider one of their closest allies, and work hard to keep relations between the two countries strong. Thus, no Sino-Soviet split in this timeline. Still, life doesn't stop just because of a Cold War. Back home in the Soviet Union, the USSR is experiencing a women's liberation movement, inspired in part by the reforms that saw more non-Russians able to rise through the ranks. More and more women are trying to break into man's world. Pointing at the 800,000 women who served in Soviet armed forces during the Great Patriotic War, they argue that if women can fight and die for the motherland, why can't they also get a good education and hold down a real job? The Soviet government is surprisingly accepting of this argument and have begun sponsoring programs to increase the involvement of women in communist society, hoping that they can offer a fresh new perspective. Unfortunately, things are a lot less progressive in America on the home front. A new and worse Red Scare is happening that can only be described as McCarthyism on steroids. Anything even remotely considered communist is stamped out. Careers are ruined. Women's liberation is considered a joke, and only, air quotes, traditional American values are supported, stopping any social progress in its tracks for decades to come. Some good old-fashioned anti-Catholic bias is also reintroduced due to the number of Catholic countries now red. There is no Great Society either, thus no Medicare or no Medicaid, because let's face it, the government paying for someone's health care is just one giant communist plot to destroy the country. In this alternate timeline, there is no Civil Rights Act or Voter Rights Act, although some states and cities do pass a few laws making life easier on African Americans. Nevertheless, it's not enough to stop a rising tide of angry and desperate black men and women. Attempts to use nonviolent resistance to protest America's racist policies quickly becomes useless as the government increasingly relies on violent means to quell protests, causing hundreds to be killed in instants across the country, leading to the deaths of civil rights leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. Because of this, more and more African Americans are turning to violent methods espoused by Malcolm X and others. This is especially true among black soldiers returning home from the wars in Latin America and finding they still can't even walk down the streets of their hometown without being assaulted by white men. Thus, they bring their training and experience to a growing rebel movement spreading across the South and the great cities of America. It also doesn't help that by the 1970s, the American economy is a wreck. As America pivots to supporting the defense industry, other areas of the economy are neglected. Meanwhile, as American military commanders resort to increasingly brutal means to stamp out communism in Latin America, the states of the CMEA institute sanctions. The few states who do freely trade with America tend to be dictatorships who talk a big game about freedom and liberty, but don't really care about the welfare of their people at all. This leads to a rise in inflation and unemployment. In light of this, national morale is at an all-time low. Cities can't handle the new drug epidemic that is sweeping the country, or the crime that it brings with it. The military is finding it hard to keep up enlistment as young men are doing anything they can to avoid fighting in the endless wars down in Latin America. Inside the army itself, the generals are struggling to deal with a rash of soldiers turning on their officers rather than follow orders. Even worse, militant black militias in the South and elsewhere are becoming more aggressive. At first, it was just a bombing campaign against government buildings and monuments to the 1861 slavery rebellion, but now these rebels are attacking military bases to steal weapons, and in some cases are driving whites out of towns in the name of the so-called Republic of New Africa. In an unrelated note, conservatives are much more supportive of gun control in this alternate timeline. The government responds by declaring martial law through much of the Black Belt and even fence off neighborhoods in major cities. Public execution of rebels is common, but they seem to have little effect outside creating new martyrs for the cause. As the government struggles to deal with these rebels, reprisals against black communities by vigilante whites is only getting worse. Other groups are targeted as well throughout the South, including anyone suspected of being a communist or civil rights activist. Even Jews, left-wing newspapers, and union members are feeling the heat as a race war spreads across America. The Soviet Union, on the other hand, couldn't be better. The 70s and 80s are a period of economic liberalization in the USSR. By the late 80s, the Soviets are communist in all but name, with their market socialist economy, much like China is in our timeline. This is helped in part by the fact they decided not to intervene in Afghanistan, since they looked at how badly America was handling their wars and thought it best to avoid repeating their mistakes. The culmination of these reforms is the reorganization of the USSR into the Union of Sovereign States in 1990. This new confederation gives the former Soviet republics complete control over their domestic affairs, especially the Baltics, who have been itching decades for it, but still ties them to the central government when it comes to foreign affairs and defense. Truly, the Soviets have shaken off the shadow of Stalin and have become a shining beacon for the entire world. Of course, that is just what they want you to think. Although things are a lot better for your average Soviet citizen in this alternate timeline, this is hardly a utopia. The Union of Sovereign States might not take you away in the middle of the night for speaking out, but being too critical of the one-party state might end with you losing your job. Also, cameras are everywhere, and no one bats an eye at the thought of the government listening in on their phone conversations, because why wouldn't they? Isn't that what the government does to protect us from fascist terrorists? The idea of a free and open internet also doesn't exist in this liberal Soviet Union. An internet of sorts does exist, but it's heavily monitored, and only government-approved websites get published. Still, while the Union of Sovereign States may not be a socialist utopia, it's still a better place than the United States in this alternate timeline. By the 90s, Americans missed the golden age of Taft and elect a new president to fix the problems at home and leave the rest of the world alone. Thus, the Cold War comes to an end, and with the thawing relations, the flow of trade gradually returns to America. The new America focuses on economic development by slashing their defense budget and spending their money on economic revitalization and social programs. Unfortunately, the new Africa movement is still a problem. Although civil rights legislation is passed, many southern state governments are rejecting it, prompting a political crisis and renewed calls for secession. This, of course, worries much of the world, who really don't like the idea of a civil war breaking out in a nuclear-armed America. While their days of a superpower are over, they still have enough hardware to cause serious damage if the violence were to spill over into the rest of the world. Worse yet, there are other issues rearing their ugly head as the clock ticks to the new millennium. Fundamentalist Islamists are becoming increasingly violent, and the communist government of the Arab Union can't handle them. Meanwhile, South Japan hasn't given up the fight yet and is experiencing a revitalization of imperial culture, which is freaking out their neighbors. Furthermore, China feels the new Union of Sovereign States has become too soft, and a new leader of the victorious Red World is needed. And that is where I will end my Soviet Union wins the Cold War timeline. Is it a Soviet wink? Oh yeah, but I didn't think I could make that plausible scenario to begin with, so I just decided to have fun with it. If you have a better scenario, I would love to hear about it in the comments. Otherwise, if you like what I do, please subscribe, share this video, support me on Patreon. I'm Matt Mitrovic, the Alternate Historian. Bye.